Hello, I'm Ellen Bintz, coming today from Wheaton, Illinois, in the USA. Welcome to Impact, a podcast about how we can each bring about real change in the world and getting practical in making that happen.
And hello, I'm Clive Johnson, coming today from Leigh-on-Sea in the UK. A special welcome if you're listening for the first time, and a big thank you to our new subscribers. Each week, we look at one aspect of how we can connect our hearts to offer healing for others with our collective intention, prayers, and meditation, and go behind the headlines of a critical happening in our world that needs our attention right now.
In today's episode, we're taking one of these regular deep dives to more fully understand and tune in with something that many of us may know only a little about and see where we might hone in with our prayers and intentions. And I can say that this episode is dense and there's a lot of information about the United Nations, but it's so good to know. And I feel like I don't know why, but I missed this in my education. Knew a little bit, but didn't know the details. And I think our listeners are going to be glad all over the world, right? Because it applies to all of us.
I think so.
It's really good information to have. So stick with us. There are a lot of facts and dates, but hopefully you'll remember what's important. So as we record today, it's January 28th. 2026.
So the United Nations has actually turned 80 this month, although it can be argued that, well, certainly the seeds were there before then, but its first General Assembly held just a few weeks ago, 80 years ago. So in this episode, we are turning our attention to the vital role played by the world's only true multinational parliament. We'll look back at some of its achievements, which is actually really quite, as you were saying, it's really quite uplifting, isn't it, to do that?
Mm-hmm.
Often we perhaps don't have such a favourable view of the UN because it doesn't always achieve what it might do, but there's a lot it achieves. The broad reach of its work and see where it has both achieved but also fallen short of its noble aim to be a force for good in the world. And we'll consider the crossroads the UN stands at today as the world faces unprecedented challenges, from climate change to armed conflicts, humanitarian crises, to a deepening lack of trust in multinational cooperation and a preference of some for promoting national interest above all else. In particular, we'll see if we might find an answer to the question, can the UN stay fit for purpose? As always, we'll return later to see where we might hone in with our intentions and prayers.
So how did it all begin? Well, the UN was born out of the ashes of the Second World War to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. This vision had taken shape even as war was raging with the Atlantic Charter of 1941. The Declaration of United Nations in 1942 by 26 nations, who were then fighting the Axis powers, and the Dumbarton Oaks Conference of 1944, where the Allied Big Four began forming proposals for the future organization's structure. Yet it was in the spring of 1945 that this vision really took form, when delegates from 50 nations gathered in San Francisco for the United Nations Conference in International Organization to craft the Charter of the United Nations and the Statute of the International Court of Justice. And I didn't know that was in San Francisco.
No.
The charter was signed on June 26, 1945, and came into force on October 24th of that year, after being ratified by the 5 permanent members of the Security Council. And that's China, France, the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, and the United States. I didn't know that either. And a majority of other signatories. The inaugural session of the UN General Assembly began on January 10th, 1946 at the Methodist Central Hall in London, in a city and world that was still ravaged by the war. Debates began immediately on pressing issues of the day, including the presence of Soviet troops in Iranian Azerbaijan and British forces in Greece, foreshadowing the geopolitical tensions that would characterize the Cold War era. The second part of the first session opened later that year in October at Flushing Meadows, Corona Park in New York, the city where the UN later established its permanent headquarters.
It was really quite a time, I think, in geopolitics. A lot going on. There was the Palestinian and the question Israel as a state came into
Oh,
being
right.
around that time. But the
Yeah.
British and French still had mandates, responsibilities. Oh, not mandates, they had responsibilities in that area. So there was quite a lot being decided in the aftermath of the war. And I think there was a real consciousness around how things had gone badly wrong in terms of the decisions
Right.
made after the First World War, which we'll touch on in just a moment. But
An
yeah,
appreciation for cooperation after all of
exactly.
this war, Yeah.
Exactly. And countries, the UK certainly was very heavily in debt to the US
Mm.
and very war weary. I imagine, I don't know, but I have this image of London at that time, still lots of bombed out buildings and, really in a very different state to what we might imagine it came to a few years later. Now, several interconnected purposes are enshrined in the UN's Charter to maintain international peace and security, to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights, to promote social progress and better standards of life, and to ensure justice and respect for international law. And at its core, the UN was a renewed attempt, following the failed League of Nations, that's what kind of preceded it really, that came into being after the First World War, to create an effective system of collective security that could prevent the catastrophic world wars that had twice, of course, devastated humanity within a single generation. As we're recording, we're actually one day on from Holocaust Memorial Day, and that was yet another, of course, this whole, one of the many missions of the UN was to act against genocide. All of this included take on board lessons that had been learned from the weaknesses of the League of Nations. The Security Council was given primary responsibility for maintaining peace and security, with 5 permanent members wielding veto power to ensure consensus among what were then the great powers. The General Assembly would provide a forum for all member states to participate in global deliberations. The principal structure also included the Economic and Social Council, which coordinates the economic, social, and related work of the UN, and the International Court of Justice. And meanwhile, there were specialist agencies created to address economic, social, cultural, and humanitarian challenges, which include ones we're very familiar with: the World Health Organization, Food and Agriculture Organization, UNESCO, that's the UN Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, the International Monetary Fund, and International Labour Organization, among others.
So, what are the UN's contributions to humanity? And we can, just what you described is
Yeah.
is part of it. The UN is often criticized, perhaps sometimes fairly, for its perceived failures and weaknesses. However, it's hard to underemphasize its many achievements and profound impacts on the lives of billions. It has survived through 80 years and achieved more than any other institution in history to further multinational cooperation. It's right that we give thanks for this, and perhaps some of us may take for granted the fact that the likes of the International Court of Justice exist in our lifetimes. Perhaps the UN's most enduring legacy is the establishment of the first comprehensive framework for human rights in international law. In 1948, its General Assembly adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights without a single dissenting vote. This landmark document, drafted by a commission chaired by Eleanor Roosevelt, holds the world record as the most translated document in human history, currently available in 523 languages. It has been incorporated into constitutions throughout the world, and this laid the groundwork for subsequent human rights treaties and established principles that have shaped international diplomacy and held governments accountable for the last 8 decades, affirming that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights, establishing social, economic, civil, and political rights as universal entitlements. And if that's all they did, that's pretty cool.
Yeah, I think so. The UN's peacekeeping missions have helped to stabilize post-conflict situations, monitor ceasefires, and create space for political processes to take root. While this aspect of the UN's role has often faced significant challenges and, indeed, failures, it has also contributed to preventing the escalation of conflicts during dangerous moments, such as the Korean War, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the 1973 Arab-Israeli War. Arguably, the UN has also helped keep the Cold War from becoming hot, and contributed to preventing another great power war since 1945. Actually, I was thinking it was quite remarkable, even in 1945, that Soviet Union was a party to this, given where Stalin was going and his plans. But yes, they signed up to it and were there in San Francisco at that charter. Rather, the UN has provided diplomatic channels, negotiating forums, and face-saving mechanisms that allowed adversaries to de-escalate tensions without losing credibility. This has paved the way for international stability, which, if it's difficult to quantify, has potentially saved millions of lives. And in the domain of its humanitarian mission, the UN has saved countless lives as well. Just to mention a couple of examples here, the World Food Programme provides food and cash assistance to over 80 million people each year, while UN agencies supply 45% of the world's children with vaccines, saving an estimated 2 to 3 million lives each year from preventable diseases. The UN has provided aid to nearly 69 million displaced people who fled their homes due to persecution, conflict, or human rights violations. And it has championed development goals and coordinated global efforts to address poverty, hunger, disease, and a lack of education. The Millennium Development Goals and their successors, the Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, have provided frameworks for measuring progress and mobilizing resources towards shared objectives. While implementation of these has been uneven, these initiatives have contributed to substantial improvements in the welfare of people around the world.
In another area, the UN, especially through the World Health Organization, has achieved remarkable public achievements in the field of health. The most striking is the complete eradication of smallpox through a coordinated global vaccination campaign. A disease that had killed millions throughout human history simply no longer exists. Other successes include dramatic reductions in polio, measles deaths declining by 88% since 2000, and the rollout of malaria vaccines in 24 African countries. Each of these achievements has required coordinated international action that may have been hard to bring about without the unifying force of the UN. In more recent decades, the UN has also stepped up to play a central role in building global consensus on environmental challenges. The 1992 Rio Earth Summit established its Framework Convention on Climate Change, the first global treaty to explicitly address climate change, to which 154 countries signed on to. This framework led to subsequent agreements, including the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement. While progress on implementation remains insufficient to meet the scale of the climate crisis, these treaties have established the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and created mechanisms for international cooperation on emissions reductions and climate adaptation. Even this year, the High Seas Treaty has been signed, this being a major global agreement to protect the world's oceans that took close to 20 years to agree and which came into force last week. That's really good. This provides a framework for the common governance of about half of our planet's surface and 95% of the ocean's volume. No mean achievement if its legacy will only be known through actions, not words.
Exactly.
Actions, not words.
It is an incredible achievement actually to get that signed, that commitment. Yes, of course it has to be put into real action, but a massive treaty. And again, it's something, a really good news story, if you like, from recent weeks that kind of was there, I think, a little bit in the news if you read your newspapers and so on, but it's understandably, perhaps, given everything else that's gone on, it's not one that is very prominent. And certainly, we often talk about failures with climate change, but these goals that were agreed to, these treaties, there are actually many countries that really are working to meet those, and have gone quite a long way with under. I know most European countries meeting quite a lot of the COP goals of recent years for achieving by 2030 is their current goal. So
Right.
again, a lot that's going on positively that we don't necessarily pick up on.
Let's say it again. High Seas Treaty. Watch for it in the news.
Yeah.
Yeah,
A
good
very,
thing.
very, very good thing. So, as we say, while it might often seem that little is being achieved, last year's Sustainable Development Goals report reveals considerable progress over the past decade. Since 2015, the world made notable strides in expanding access to education, improving maternal and child health, and bridging the digital divide. Effective prevention efforts have significantly reduced the burdens of infectious diseases such as HIV and malaria. Access to electricity has continued to grow, with 45 countries achieving universal electricity access, and renewable energy now being the fastest rising source of power worldwide. That's quite something, isn't it, as well?
Yay.
There is, of course, a long way to go, and in areas such as addressing the challenges of climate change, as we mentioned, much more is urgently needed. But the importance of what has been achieved, really because of the UN, shouldn't be underplayed. Kind of one of these situations where you think, what would it be like if we didn't have it?
Mhm.
Where would we be now? We don't know, but I suspect we'd be quite some way behind on many of these things. So much
Absolutely.
that we suggest that we should give thanks for and enjoy celebrating the UN's existence, its continued existence, and its many achievements.
However, the UN's work hasn't always run smoothly, and the organization has and does face many challenges and critics.
We said this would be
Prob-
an episode of two parts, didn't we?
yeah. Aw. After all that good stuff, I hate to bring in this bad stuff, but you have to
We should
do
have
it.
done it the other way around, maybe, but there we are.
Probably the most frequently cited flaw in the UN structure is the veto power held by the 5 permanent members of the Security Council. These essentially being the Allied powers who were victorious in the Second World War, along with China. The design was intended to ensure great power consensus and prevent the organization from acting against the interest of its most powerful members. However, the veto has increasingly been used to protect national or allied interests, undermining the Council's ability to respond to crisis. Russia's vetoes on Syria and the United States' vetoes protecting Israel represent high profile examples of how this mechanism can paralyze collective action, even in the face of massive humanitarian suffering. Critics argue that the Security Council's composition reflects the power dynamic of 1945 rather than the contemporary world, with there being no permanent representation for Africa, Latin America, or most of Asia. The Council's failure to respond effectively to the 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine, the ongoing Gaza crisis, and the humanitarian catastrophe in Sudan has led some to describe the situation as, quote, crisis of relevance for the UN. Reform proposals have been made for decades, but the requirement that any charter amendment must be ratified by all 5 permanent members, each of whom would lose relative power through reform, creates a seemingly unsurmountable barrier to change.
Does seem a bit odd, doesn't it? It is. I mean, yes, of those, Russia, China, the US, they are still major powers. But yeah, we're not in 1945 now, and there clearly isn't there isn't clear representation of the state of the
No.
world. Yeah. The UN record sadly includes devastating failures that have undermined its credibility. UN peacekeepers stood by helplessly during the 1994 Rwandan genocide, which claimed approximately 800,000 lives in 100 days. The 1995 Srebrenica massacre occurred in a UN-declared safe area under the nominal protection of UN forces. UN peacekeepers brought cholera to Haiti in 2010, causing an outbreak that killed thousands. and the organization was slow to acknowledge responsibility. Sexual abuse by peacekeepers in the Democratic Republic of Congo and elsewhere has betrayed the trust of vulnerable populations the UN was meant to protect. And in contemporary conflicts, the UN has struggled to fulfill its mandate. In Syria, the civil war continued for over a decade, with limited UN impact on either the fighting or the humanitarian catastrophe. The organization failed to prevent or respond effectively to the 2017 ethnic cleansing of Rohingya Muslims in Myanmar, as an internal report on Sri Lanka found that the UN headquarters had been heavily influenced by what it perceived member states wanted to hear, rather than what member states needed to know, representing a fundamental failure of the organization's truth-telling function.
That is not good.
No.
So the UN now faces a severe and worsening financial crisis that directly compromises its ability to fulfill its mandates. The 2025 peacekeeping budget of $5.38 billion faces a massive gap between approval budgets and actual cash availability. As of late October 2025, only 61 member states had fully paid their peacekeeping contributions. This shortfall forced the Secretary-General to implement emergency measures, including a 50% reduction in expenditure across all operations, the repatriation of approximately 25% of peacekeepers, and the termination of civilian staffing positions. The humanitarian situation is even more dire. The UN's 2025 Global Humanitarian Overview sought nearly $48 billion to assist 189 million people across 72 countries, but received only $12 billion, less than 26% of requirements. For 2026, the UN has been forced to halve its funding target to $23 billion for 87 million people, a dramatic contraction in ambition driven by major funding cuts from the United States and European donors. UN Emergency Relief Coordinator Tom Fletcher described making, quote, agonizing life and death decisions, unquote, about which crises to prioritize. The consequences are stark. Food rations halved in refugee camps. Over 150 health facilities closed in Somalia. And assistance in Afghanistan dropping from 5 million people in 2024 to just 1 million in 2025.
Yeah. It's quite shocking, isn't it, really? The cuts that have to be made. Yeah. Current UN operations also face many challenges. In Gaza, humanitarian access remains severely restricted despite the pause in fighting, with aid levels falling short of actual needs. The UN's role has been sidelined by other actors, and Israel has accused the organization of complicity with Hamas. In Sudan, where one of the world's worst humanitarian crises intensifies, as we know, warring factions have blocked UN diplomacy and humanitarian assistance. And across the border in South Sudan, the UN mission reports deep concerns about military confrontations between government forces, while the Democratic Republic of Congo, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, rebel groups have killed Blue Helmet peacekeepers. At the same time, Security Council discussions about Haiti and Somalia have languished due to a lack of engagement from the major powers. The organization has made no meaningful progress in resolving major conflicts in Sudan and Myanmar, which have been intermittent priorities for the Council in recent years. And resettlement quotas for refugees are expected to fall to their lowest level in 2 decades. That will be when last year's figures are brought together, even as 2.5 million refugees require resettlement, exposing vulnerable people to grave danger. Furthermore, any cooperation that the UN might enable on the question of the regional spheres of influence policy being pursued by the US and other major powers seems doomed by the fact that 3 of the Security Council's members include the very powers advocating such a policy, and all 3 seemingly having great interest in the Arctic as well.
Yeah. So, what are the UN's current engagements and focus? It's perhaps timely to briefly mention some of the areas where the UN is currently active. after that news, let's change to something else.
Mm.
As of now, the UN maintains 11 active peacekeeping operations, and the largest missions include MINUSCA in the Central African Republic. These acronyms are kind of funny.
They're not easy, are they? Some of them.
No. UNMISS in South Sudan, MONUSCO in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and UNIFIL between Israel and Lebanon. And these missions operate in some of the world's most dangerous and complex environments, being tasked with protecting civilians, supporting political processes, and facilitating humanitarian access despite severe resource constraints. The humanitarian crisis in Gaza represents one of the most visible challenges that the UN is responding to. The ceasefire agreement that began in October 2025 has now held for over 100 days as of January 2026, an achievement we should be grateful for. But this scale up of humanitarian work continues to be hampered by restrictions, impediments, and harsh weather. The UN and partners are working to restore critical health services, keeping about half of Gaza's 36 hospitals at least partially functional, deploying emergency medical teams, and supporting over 8,000 medical evacuations to 30 countries. Despite these efforts, UN Secretary-General António Guterres has described the situation as having, quote, a level of death and destruction that has no parallel in recent times, unquote, fundamentally undermining basic conditions of human dignity. Phase 2 of the ceasefire implementation has now begun, and the UN reiterating that humanitarian aid must flow unimpeded. The ceasefire must be implemented in full, and the situation must lead to an irreversible path toward a two-state solution in accordance with international law. As targeted killings and bombings continue, this remains a fragile situation.
Mm. And in Ukraine, the UN continues efforts to stop the fighting and achieve a just and lasting peace in line with the UN Charter, international law, and UN resolutions. It has been active in providing humanitarian assistance, while the Security Council authorized work strictly focused on supporting ceasefire mechanisms. We should remember that Russia is itself a member of the Security Council, so this isn't an insignificant commitment, even if that country continues its assault on the ground. The General Assembly has passed resolutions demanding respect for Ukraine's territorial integrity and calling for accountability for violations of international law. And the UN has also focused on facilitating the return of Ukrainian children forcibly taken to Russia, coordinating actions through the Secretary-General's Special Representative for Children and Armed Conflict. As we mentioned, Sudan faces what many consider one of the world's worst humanitarian catastrophes. The UN appeal includes $2 billion for the internally displaced and $1 billion to assist refugees escaping the conflict. However, warring factions have consistently blocked UN diplomacy and humanitarian access, severely limiting the organization's effectiveness. Peace efforts in neighboring South Sudan remain similarly challenged. However, Syria presents a more hopeful picture following the fall of Bashar al-Assad's regime in December 2024. More than 2.5 million Syrians have voluntarily returned home since the political transition. I think it's what a lot of people who fear migrants coming and staying in their country, they should take note of this. You know, when situations are safe for people to return to their country, often they will. Anyway, that's an aside. Some pulling out of resettlement processes in favor of plans to rebuild. However, the 2026 humanitarian situation in Syria remains very dire. The UN appeal includes over $2 billion for emergency assistance inside Syria and nearly $3 billion for Syrian refugees in neighboring countries. The United States gave just $139 million to Syria last year, which was a 63% decline from the previous year, representing a devastating reduction for a country with a generational chance to transition from humanitarian crisis to reconstruction.
On climate and environmental action, the UN continues to lead global climate efforts following COP30 in Brazil, which delivered several positive outcomes. the Belém adaptation indicators for the Global Goal on Adaptation, the Just Transition Mechanism, and a tripling of adaptation finance. Looking ahead to COP31 in Antalya, Turkey, when Australia will take the presidency, I hope that's a good thing. The focus shifts to implementation against political headwinds. The World Health Organization, and Brazil released a report showing how climate change has intensified a global health emergency, with extreme heat causing over 540,000 deaths annually, and 1 in 12 hospitals at risk of climate-related shutdowns. The newly launched Belém Health Action Plan translates scientific warnings into action pathways, marking a decisive moment when the world has the tools it needs to respond. So interesting how the climate issue affects the health issue and everything works together.
There's a lot interrelated. In some ways, though, the UN is, in theory, is in a good position to coordinate, pull those things together. Progress has been made on sustainable development, but this is insufficient. The 10th Annual Sustainable Development Goals report, released in July last year, gave a stark assessment. The SDGs have improved millions of lives, but the current pace of change is insufficient to meet all goals by 2030, which is its kind of target at the moment for all of these goals. Only 35% of targets are on track or making moderate progress. Nearly half are moving too slowly, and 18% have regressed. Yet despite these setbacks, notable achievements include extreme poverty reduction, dramatic declines in child and maternal mortality, substantial increases in girls' access to education, reduced burdens from HIV, malaria, and neglected tropical diseases, and the elimination of specific diseases in 54 countries, which is really quite something. However, universal health coverage and emergency protection are still lagging, and progress on maternal and child deaths is not falling fast enough to reach global targets. The report calls for action across 6 priority areas where intensified effort can generate transformative impact: food systems, energy access, digital transformation, education, jobs and social protection, and climate and biodiversity action. Secretary-General Guterres emphasized, "We are in a global development emergency. Sustainable development goals are still within reach, but only if we act with urgency, unity, and unwavering resolve."
It seems so worthwhile to keep these initiatives moving forward.
Yes. And sometimes it can be a case of, 1 step back and 2 steps forward. Sometimes there can be these sudden pushes forward that means that, there's more hope that more will be achieved by 2030.
Which one of them is the World Health Organization achievements, which is perhaps the most significant health milestone last year. It was the adoption by WHO member states of the Pandemic Agreement, a landmark step toward making the world safer from future pandemics. Alongside this, amendments to the international health regulations came into force, including a new pandemic emergency alert level designed to trigger stronger global cooperation. In a historic show of support, governments increased their contributions to WHO's core budget, ensuring more sustainable financing for the organization's work. WHO also advanced public health across multiple fronts in 2025, validating the safety and life-saving impact of vaccines, issuing guidance on innovations such as injectable lenacapavir for HIV prevention and GLP-1 therapies for obesity, responding to humanitarian crisis in Gaza, Sudan, and Ukraine, supporting countries in achieving universal health coverage, and seeing the UN General Assembly adopt a landmark political declaration addressing non-communicable diseases and mental health challenges. WHO's 14th General Program of Work, lasting through to 2028, sets ambitious targets: 6 billion people to enjoy better health and well-being, 5 billion to benefit from universal health coverage without financial hardship, and 7 billion to be better protected from health emergencies. Well, let's hope that happens.
Yeah. I only found out today that it came up in my Inside Timer meditation. Someone put in the chat that the US apparently is no longer a member of World Health Organization. I didn't know that. They withdrew.
I'm so sorry. Yeah.
There was an executive order, would you believe? But
Oh
yeah,
no.
no, that's apparently been about a year they've been out of it, which is
Mhm.
sad because they would obviously be a very important contributor. But there we are.
Yeah.
The UN 80 initiative, something we should mention. The UN is now focused on shaping up internally with its UN 80 initiative. Another of these well thought through names, isn't it?
Yeah.
Perhaps you get a badge. You come up with a good acronym for a new initiative or something later. This is described as a system-wide push to streamline operations, sharpen impact, and reaffirm the UN's relevance for a rapidly changing world. Get rid of a lot of bureaucracy, I think, in other words. This builds
Yes.
on ongoing reform efforts, including the Pact for the Future, which was adopted at the September 2024 Summit of the Future, and UN 2.0, and is working to identify efficiencies and improvements, including structural changes in the organization. The Pact for the Future itself, which was adopted by all UN member states, pledges 56 actions in sustainable development and financing, international peace and security, science and technology, youth and future generations, and transforming global governance. It commits to enhance roles for the Commission on the Status of Women and strengthened financial means for mobilizing capital to meet climate challenges, among other areas. I think that's been one of the problems in the past. A lot of this bureaucracy actually to get finance. We've mentioned that with some of these poorer countries needing grants and so on can take years. Reform of the Security Council remains perhaps the most contentious and essential element of modernization for the UN, which the Pact for the Future commits to in order to make it more representative, inclusive, transparent, efficient, effective, democratic, and accountable. Proposals include expanding the Council to 25 members, with 6 additional permanent and 4 additional non-permanent seats, and full equality being demanded by the African Union. Quite right.
Yes.
The current 5 permanent members, of course, will need to ratify any charter amendment, which may prove challenging.
Or impossible.
Or impossible. Or it almost gets down to, if it's, well, you have one European seat, UK or France, which of you two wants to give it up?
Right. No, they're not going to do that.
It's not going to be an easy one, is it? Sadly.
Right.
Looking forward, we come back to the question we began with. How can the UN remain a force for good in such uncertain times? This is perhaps where our intention and prayers are most needed now. As we know, the multinational system faces what many would describe as its greatest crisis since the Second World War, straining under disordered global power dynamics and a move towards powerful nations exerting regional influence. UN is struggling with a growing disregard for the rule of law, nuclear proliferation, the rise of nationalist policymaking, backtracking on global climate action, and efforts to undermine gender equality. It is receiving political pushback and operational threats and blocks in many conflict zones. Its funding is unpredictable, severely challenging its capacity to respond to peacekeeping and humanitarian needs. It needs to reduce structural imbalances within its own organization that disadvantage less wealthy states, including better debt management, as we mentioned, and increased financing for the SDGs. It requires serious action on climate change, which acts as a threat multiplier, exacerbating, we said, food insecurity, water scarcity, and forced displacement, adding to the migration problem. And at the same time, it needs to shift from reactive crisis management to proactive prevention and addressing root causes of conflict and suffering.
Ultimately, the UN's path forward requires a mass renewed commitment to its founding principles, the sovereign quality of all member states, peaceful settlement of disputes, refraining from the threat or use of force, non-intervention in domestic affairs, and respecting human rights and fundamental freedoms. These principles enshrined in the Charter remain as relevant today as they were in 1945. They require all member nations to uphold international humanitarian law and human rights standards, regardless of who they are or what power they yield. This means speaking truth to power, maintaining impartiality in conflicts, and refusing to subordinate humanitarian principles to political expediency. Easier said than done, I
Mm,
guess.
mm.
And as we stated in Geneva last year at the launch of UN 80, quote, the need for effective, inclusive, and adaptive multilateralism has never been more evident. No country, no matter how powerful, can face these challenges alone, unquote. And in what is his final year as UN Secretary-General, Antonio Guterres warned that the world is brimming with conflict, impunity, inequality, and unpredictability. Even as international cooperation is fraying at the moment, it is most needed. He asserted that the United Nations has never been more needed, while acknowledging that the strength of multilateralism is never automatic. It must be built patiently through dialogue, trust, and compromise. Yet he promised that a better world is possible and called on all leaders to get serious, choose people and the planet over pain. A safer world begins by investing more in fighting poverty and less in fighting wars. Peace must prevail.
Very, very wise words, isn't it?
Very wise.
And certainly this, yeah, never more needed.
Right.
All of the major problems. We mentioned the migration crisis, for example, the climate
Right.
change crisis, the security issues, and the regional spheres of influence, and so on. All of these need this multilateral, yes, multinational. Said it right the first time. Cooperation.
Yes.
And yeah, if you get to the root, if you sort out what's going on in countries where people are having to flee because they haven't got water, for example, we sort out a lot of the issues ultimately around wars, conflicts, over resources, over issues
Right.
like the migration issue and so on.
Mm-hmm.
So, where might we hone in with our intentions and prayers? So, as always, this is the point you may wish to bookmark to come back to. And as always, we're just going to mention a number of suggested themes in fairly quick order that you may wish to pause between in order to hold intention for, hold in your prayers. So, taking a moment just to become present where you are, letting go of anything that doesn't serve you in this moment, really connecting with your own ground of being and feeling into these intentions in whatever way is meaningful for you. We give thanks for the existence of the United Nations and the many achievements it has made during its 80 years of existence.
We will for wisdom for the UN's leaders and influencers to know how most effectively to undertake their roles for the highest good, and to guide diplomacy with member nation representatives in a way that serves the interest and goals both of the organization and of the global community as a whole.
We will that the representatives of all member nations of the UN and the power brokers of their own nations they influence will be inspired to recognize the past achievements of having regard for international law and be moved to continue to respect this.
We pray that wealthy nations will recognize the value to themselves alongside the humanitarian and compassionate need for contributing generous funding toward peacekeeping, combating climate change, and humanitarian needs.
We pray that all who have influence and have wisdom will have wisdom to know how the UN's organization may be reformed in a way that removes structural imbalances, doesn't disadvantage less wealthy states, and includes improved financing arrangements for funding needs.
We ask that those who have influence will have wisdom to know how to allow the UN's agencies to become more proactive in preventing and addressing the root causes of conflict and suffering, not just in responding to emergencies.
We will, that the members of the United Nations will be moved to trust that working together to face global challenges like climate change may serve the highest good of all.
We will that the members of the United Nations who advocate national interest or regional spheres of influence will be moved to see that this need not be in conflict with working together to face global challenges for the good of all.
And this week, as we consider the vital role and many challenges the UN faces as it marks its 80-year anniversary, we suggest holding as our main intention. We will that all global leaders will be moved by United Nations Secretary-General António Guterres' call to get serious, choose people and planet over pain. Please join us in holding this.
Remember the wise words.
Remember the wise words, indeed. And I think some of those intentions as well, we mentioned there, national interest, regional interest, and spheres of influence and so on, they don't have to be in conflict with what the UN is about. As we said, things like climate change and migration, they are concerns for everybody, and you have to cooperate.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Now we completely separate from the UN. We probably should mention very quickly, and we're not sure yet, we may well be able to put out an episode on this, but contemplative activism and how relevant and important that is at the moment. And from time to time, there is an offering, isn't there, the Legacy Labyrinth project for some introductory training around that.
Yes. So in this time of conflict, especially in my country, the US, this is becoming more and more important to investigate. And so this Saturday, which is January 31st, I will be leading with Chris Katzenmeyer, the executive director of the Legacy Labyrinth Project, an intro class into contemplative labyrinth activism, talking about contemplative activism and how it differs from other kinds of activism and how powerful it can be. So we will provide the link. We would love to have you join us. I think you'll find it fascinating and hopeful, and hopefully put it into practice. If you could join us, that would be great.
Wonderful. That's on Zoom, presumably, is it?
It's on Zoom. 2 hours on Saturday.
Wonderful. It's the same one I went on a while back. I can thoroughly recommend.
Thank you. So that about wraps it up for this episode. It's been a lot, but I hope you have some takeaways that you will talk about with friends and family and remember and hold the UN in your heart with the intention. Remember, you can connect with us, the Facebook group. We'd love to hear what you thought of this and what your takeaway is. And for live intention holding in Clive's daily Insight Timer offerings, and with me in the Labyrinth Activist Network's Zoom calls. Details of how to hook up with these are in our show notes. Look out, too, for our next special topic episode, which we'll hopefully be releasing in the next few days. Thank you for listening and for sharing with us and holding intentions. We look forward to connecting again next time. And in the meantime,
thank you. Go well. Stay safe.
And remember, we are more powerful together.
Impact is presented by Ellen Bintz and Clive Johnson and produced by Impact Productions. Our theme music is by Chris Collins and our logo artwork is by Auto Classic. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Audible or your favorite podcast provider. We're a non-commercial podcast dedicated to people of any faith tradition or none who yearn for healing in our troubled world. Please pass on the word so others may join us in making an impact. Thank you for listening.